Okay, so we will start since it's 1:30 Central European time. So thank you so much for those who are attending us and to all our speakers. It's been a very busy few days and weeks, I think, for people with both concerns and discussions around the Paris Summit that was convened last week. So this is a debrief. This seminar is intended as a debrief to understand the implications and the outcomes of what's come out of the summit for the work of all the organizations and people working in the space. It is co-organized by the Center for Economic and Social Rights, Climate Action, CAN International, CAN France, Budget Advocacy Network, and Eurodad. So thank you very much for joining us today. Just in terms of the format and how we've organized it, we have basically 5 speakers and I'm moderating. My name is Meghna Abraham. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights. We will have 2 rounds of questions that I'll be asking the panelists to respond to, and then we will open up for audience questions. So for the audience questions, please type any questions or if you have a comment in the chat, and one of my colleagues will compile those so we can put as many of those questions forward to the panelists. And just as a reminder, we do have interpretation, so please do pick the channel that you would prefer to listen to, which is English, French, and Spanish. Yeah, so we're going to go straight in because there's a lot to discuss, and we hope to get as many questions as possible. So in terms of, I'm just going to quickly introduce the speakers as I ask them questions. The first speaker that we have today is Yolanda Frestanillo. Yolanda is the Policy and Advocacy Manager on Debt Justice at Eurodad, and she has, over the last 2 decades, been closely involved in local, national, and international social movements and has campaigned on a variety of issues from development finance, debt, human rights, and feminism. And it's great to have Yolanda here with us because she has also been closely following the Paris Summit. So Yolanda, as someone who's followed multiple debates around debt and climate, could you please tell us whether you think the summit has advanced or undermined debt and climate justice in any way? And we'd really appreciate it if you could please highlight what you thought were some of the most significant aspects of the discussions and outcomes. Over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for putting this together so close to the summit, so we can do this and then forget about this enormous distraction that President Macron put on our way. I'm going to start with the second part of the question, which is what the outcomes have been. And the French presidency presented this summit as a global effort, something that would unite us towards some kind of transformation. The truth is that they didn't have a single global agreement or commitment in the summit or throughout the process. They tried to agree on a multilateral development bank's vision statement. We still don't know if there is a vision statement out. It is included in the summary, and they say 30 countries have sign it, but what we know is that there was a lot of discussion and not a lot of inclusion in the process, and many global south countries said no to the vision statement. What we also know is that there was a summary of the discussions in the summer in the summit presented by the French president. It's in their website, and a roadmap, which is a very global north vision of what the discussions were. We could perfectly see, because it was open and hear different proposals from global south governments on the need to profoundly transform international financial architecture, Bretton Woods institutions calling for decolonize the Bretton Woods institutions, the Chad president calling for debt cancellation, and also criticism on how the process had been taken, particularly in the morning session on Friday. None of this is in the summary, obviously, that the French have put out there. There is this roadmap signaling different occasions in the following months where some of the things being discussed in the summit could be followed up. Only one of those events is a UN event, which is the SDG summit in September. It feels like as if the global north was afraid of discussing on equal footing with the global south how this transformation should take place. And they definitely prefer this kind of multi-stakeholder shows where they can define what the outcomes are instead of having meaningful discussions, member state-led discussions at the UN, ending with concrete commitments. On debt and climate, one of the things that happened is that some of the countries, it was very interesting to see how, for instance, the announcement of the deal that Zambia reached with its bilateral lenders was held until the summit. So days before, everyone knew that there was an agreement, and it wasn't announced until the summit, as if it was a result of the summit, which obviously it wasn't. And they tried to call it a historical event. Well, after 2.5 years of negotiations, you can hardly call this historical. Not a single dollar of debt cancellation for Zambia so far. So there is interest rate reduction, and there is an extension of the periods for payment for Zambia, but not a single dollar of debt cancellation for any country. As Vanessa Nakate said in the inauguration, and as we have been saying, there's no possibility of climate justice without debt cancellation for many countries at this point. Instead of that, on debt, what they put on the table is this debt process. Obviously, these clauses that they will apparently add to new loans, bilaterals, but also the World Bank, can be positive for the future. The problem is that we have a problem today, and these clauses won't apply to the debt today. So if a hurricane reaches Barbados today, this won't solve anything. And I think this is the tale that explains everything. All of the proposals discussed are for the future, but not a single decision making on what needs to be done today. And I'll finalize with that. Not a single additional dollar was put on the table by the Global North countries. They just repackaged existing commitments, but they didn't offer anything either on climate finance or on anything else that implied an additional effort from the Global North. So I think we need to make clear that, yeah, they want to mobilize trillions of private finance that we don't really know what will happen with those, but that they are not willing to make any effort. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. That I think is really helpful to start us off on the reality of what happened rather than the packaging. And I'll move on to Jayati Ghosh for the second question. I think Jayati needs no introduction. She is her title is she's a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, but she has taught economics for many years before that at a legendary institute called the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. She's also a prolific author and commentator, and she is a co-chair of the International Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation and an advisor and on many to many international organizations and panels. So moving over to you, Jayati. Jayati, you've written and spoken about the myth of the financing gap, which the summit claimed to try and bridge. How far do you think the summit has delivered on its promise of rethinking global financial architecture and climate action?
Well, I think, in fact, Yolanda already brought it out. It's done nothing whatsoever in terms of rethinking the architecture. There was a rather pathetic mention, as Yolanda mentioned, by the World Bank, the new World Bank president, that he's going to forgive debts to some extent when you have a major climate disaster, but not existing debts, only in the future. But other than that, none of the major promises that we were also led to believe would occur in a whole range of areas which are really low-hanging fruit, which can be done quite easily, and where many civil society organizations had actually participated in writing letters and saying, you can do this, you can do that. Obviously, none of this was ever intended. This was yet another rather pompous pageant without any meaning. And I don't know how many of these the world can afford. But I want to actually call attention to another aspect of the climate finance, which I think all of us should be much more noisy about. It's not just the fact of the lack of commitments, but it's that the commitments they've already made are meaningless. And I think we're not making enough noise about this. I want to highlight, I don't know how many of you have seen, if I can, I will put it into the chat, but there is this recent investigation by Reuters, which talks about the kinds of investments that qualify as climate finance. And the reason is because there's no definition. Any country can declare anything as climate finance. So what are the examples that the Reuters investigation found, which have been declared by countries to the UN as part of their climate finance? Italy has assisted a retailer to open chocolate and gelato stores across Asia. The United States has paid a Marriott hotel company for a coastal hotel expansion, which is on a hill. It's not even by the beach. Belgium has financed a film which is set in the Argentine rainforest. Japan is financing a coal plant in Bangladesh, an airport in Egypt, etc. I could go on and on. But the point is really that therefore we now know that even the money they claim they have spent, like Japan is the largest spender, 36 billion apparently they have spent so far. Of that, what Reuters was able to discover is that around half of that was money that never got used. It never actually happened as an investment. And a very large part of it was, in fact, in fossil fuels or in things like airports, which will add to global warming, which are passing off as climate finance. So it's very important for us to actually call this bluff because, you know, we get all excited when they say, oh, climate finance has gone up. Macron claimed, right, that this year it will actually meet the 100 billion target. What does that mean if, in fact, that target is meaningless, if there's not really anything useful happening out of that finance? And I think that should be that should have been the minimum thing that a summit like this achieves, a definition of climate finance, a very clear definition that lays boundaries into what you can call climate finance and what you can't. There's a lot more that I could say, but I really want to emphasize two other points. That yes, there's the whole issue of the debt, which Yolanda mentioned. There are all the other possibilities that could have occurred. But the one thing that seems to have gone from the global discussion is SDRs. Now, we now know that this reissue of SDRs, for God knows what reason, is not happening easily. Yet, in fact, you could just simply issue more SDRs. You could simply have another new SDR issue, which is costless for the global economy, for all these governments. Even recycling SDRs is minimal cost, and yet the rich countries are not willing to do it. But having a new issue is completely costless, and it seems to have completely dropped from the agenda. So I just leave you there with these points. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jyoti. And I'll be moving on to Mariana Pauli. Mariana has also worked extensively on the issue of climate finance for a very long time, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more to add to this. Mariana is the global advocacy lead at ChristianAid and the co-chair of the Climate Action Network International Climate Finance Working Group. So Mariana, you have campaigned for many years for increased climate finance and climate justice. How would you situate the discussions at the summit in the context of other UN climate negotiations that you're following closely and other negotiations to reform multilateral development banks? Are there any proposals that you think need to be countered or promoted from what you've seen come out so far?
Hi, thanks, Megan, for the question and for having me here today. counter definitely many of them. I mean, to some extent, of course, the results of the Pact Summit are disappointing, but it's not a surprise given the way the process was led, called unilaterally by France, and happening outside of UN spaces where all countries have equal voices. And there's very same institutions that really have outsized power in global financial institutions. So what we have seen is, again, them relying on instruments that create or intensify debt, deepen privatization and financialization. So it's all really largely rooted in this market-based extractive ideology. So to some extent, it was a really big missed opportunity to advance the agenda on climate justice, on climate finance that we're trying to move forward within the UN climate negotiations. In fact, yeah, it's not just the lack of real progress, but we have to counter a number of them. Just to pick up some of them here, the major problem is the over-reliance on private sector as a solution to deliver climate finance. We see in the UN developing countries really united, calling for new additional public grants-based finance to address loss and damage, for adaptation, for a just clean energy future. The Paris Agreement is actually based under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities, meaning developed countries who are the historical polluters, must pay their fair share of climate finance. It's about reparation, but by failing private sector first type of approaches, they're really refusing that responsibility. So when the Pact Summit they do recognize that you need to boost climate finance for climate action, but private investment often neglect adaptations and are completely inadequate to address loss and damage. We also witness more debt-inducing instruments. The 100 billion you see, as Javati said, there's everything underneath that, and also, we know that it's largely loans based. The rechanneling of the SDRs, even when they happen, because we know 20 billion are still depending on US approval, for example, they would be channeled through the IMF and the Resilient Sustainability Trust, the RST, which inevitably will continue to apply the conditionalities, closure of fiscal space, which we have 85% of the world under some kind of austerity today. So when we see the attempt to really shift the climate finance out of the UN system, making the MDBs as the main channel, that's a huge problem. We see MDBs are continue to fund gas, coal, oil. We saw gas is still promoted as a transition fuel. Fossil fuel subsidies are left completely untouched. And on the other hand, the main issue in terms of that we need, which is make polluters pay, when fossil fuel companies are making obscene profits, they were left completely out of the hook. The Pact Summit should have made taxation on big polluters really central to its outcomes, and this was largely missing. And other false solutions we saw in the Pact, which are false solutions within the UN space, like the promotion of insurance schemes, like the German-led Global Shield to address loss and damage instead of grant space, the promotion of carbon markets, given the license for polluters to continue business as usual, and this fossil fuels phase out largely absent. So there's some of the wrong solutions that the Pact Summit promoted that we'll have to counter within the UN space. Now, I think in terms of other negotiations to reform MDBs, there is a big distraction that the Pact Summit have done. The World Bank evolution has a lot of performative reform, appears to be doing something ambitious when it's in fact really disconnect from what the Global South have been asking for. So when we're looking at, again, the role of the private sector to bring the solution, the likes of G7 and these institutions are really not taking their responsibility out of their balance sheets. And so it's not grounded on the polluters pay principle, and it's really like obfuscating their responsibilities. I just wanted to conclude here saying, I think what Mia Motley was saying, when it should be about saving lives, not saving profits. We know that money is available when there is political will. Okay? Housing crisis, 2008, the COVID vaccines. So there is no excuse to provide public money at scale to address the climate crisis. Now, the UNFCCC should really be central to channel climate finance. And the Pact Summit has shown how the big divergence between the approaches of developing and developed countries. So moving forward in our actions, this is what we should pay attention to. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mariana. And I'll move on to Carola. Carola Mejia is a Bolivian economist who specialized in sustainable development with more than 15 years experience as an advisor in public, private, and international cooperation organization, as well as coordinator of various regional climate networks. Carola works as the climate finance analyst in the area of new financial architecture in Latindad. So Carola, you have made numerous proposals for reforms to help create a new financial architecture for the climate and to realize the 2030 SDG agenda. Could you please share your view on the summit's approach to using public resources to de-risking private investments and other market-based approaches to addressing climate finance gaps?
Yes, thank you very much, Meghna, for the invitation. On behalf of Latindad, we're very, very happy to be in this space. Building on what Mariana was already mentioning, I think what the previous speakers were already mentioning, this summit didn't deliver any proposal for a real transformation of the financial architecture, and they were just promoting the same things. As Mariana was mentioned, one of these things is a stronger participation of the private sector as the silver bullet, the magical solution to close these financial gaps. And we really don't agree with the global north, with the rich countries, to use the climate emergency and the need of trillions to bring others to the table and dilute their responsibility in this crisis. So when we review the roadmap, the proposals, everything it has the private sector at the core, promoting PPPs, de-risking their investments, using, as you were mentioning, public resources to risk their investments, promoting blended finance, markets-based mechanisms like carbon markets that have been proven to be a false solution and not effective to reduce the emissions. Also, new windows for the private sector in the World Bank. So we don't really agree with that approach. We think it's not going to solve anything. It didn't solve it in the FFD process, for example, where private sector is also seen as the big solution, but it's not. And this is because mainly due to 4 elements. First, the risk in private investments with public money reduces money that could be directly invested in social sectors, in social security, in health, in education, and in climate resilience. And this is linked to the next point that I want to make. Private investors are guided by profit and the desire of wealth generation at any cost. So they, as Mariana was mentioning, they are not interested in investing in adaptation and in loss and damage. They have nothing to win. So that's a big thing that we need to understand. And from the Global South perspective, adaptation and loss and damage should be and is a priority for us. 3.6 billion people live in contexts very high vulnerable to climate change right now, and that's the type of of support we need, financial support we need. And this support should be grant-based public finance, not anything else, for that, especially for adaptation and for loss and damage. And I'm very surprised to hear some global north countries talking in the United Nations, for example, that they are going to create adaptation markets to attract investors. That's really something that is not a solution. We have to be very serious about this. Markets have created the environmental crisis that we are facing now, and they won't be the solution. They say also that there is not enough public money, but we know that is not true. And the public money right now of global north countries is going to sectors that harm people and harm the planet. For example, high subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, military expenditures, investments in extractive sectors in our countries that are depleting our nature, that are harming people and communities, and are not solving this crisis that we are facing right now. And fourth, and I think this is very important point to make out, they are trying to bring different types of contributors to the table: private sector, MDBs, South-South cooperation, philanthropists. And that's, I think, that is a strategy to dilute the responsibility of these rich countries in regards to the historical debt, the historical, ecological, and climate debt they have with us, with the planet, and also the unfulfillment of their commitments, as Jayati was mentioning previously. And that's something I also saw in official spaces like the UNFCCC, when we were discussing about the new collective quantified goal for climate finance in Bonn 2 weeks ago. Countries like France, rich countries, were promoting this same approach to bring everybody to the table, to align this new goal to Article 2.1c. So all the countries do the efforts to align the financial flows with low carbon, low emission models of development. But at the end, they are neglecting the responsibility they have. They are not giving the reparations they should be given according to Article 9. The 100 billion goal was really a bad goal, but at least we knew it was a commitment made from north to the south, and not as part of solidarity, but as part of reparations and responsibility they have and they owe us. So we really have to be very aware of these processes as well, and this strategy they are trying to promote. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Carola. And moving on to Matthew Paris. Matthew is the coordinator of the French Platform on Debt and Development, PFDD. The PFDD brings together 26 French organizations and unions acting in favor of a broad, fair, and sustainable solution to the debt problem of Global South countries. Matthew, you've been following the organization of this summit closely from the ground and are aware of the concerns around participation of civil society and movements, particularly from the Global South, in this process. Could you share your thoughts with us about the implications of the summit, both in substantive terms, but also in terms of its legitimacy, given these concerns?
Thank you, Magna, and hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, and I will continue in French. En effet, de mon côté, je ne reviendrai pas justement trop sur le fond politique des choses qui ont été décidées ou discutées, car je partage ce qui a été dit par les panélistes précédentes, très clairement. Mais en effet, côté société civile...
Our former speakers have said very valuable things at the level of civil society. In November 2022, we gave this announcement of Emmanuel Macron's announcement in COP27 to organize 7 months later a summit for a new financial agreement. Just to say that very quickly, the French NGOs active on issues of development mobilize themselves to contact the teams and ask for an interview, which was granted in mid-December 2022. During that interview, we saw that the leaders of the French and the French presidency did that announcement, and they were surprised by this initiative. To answer this question, the inclusion of civil society and the countries of the South, we discovered that there were certain thematic themes with groups of countries from the north, and we insisted so that the south would be present. And the argument was the Indian co-president co-chairing. We saw the result of this with the absence of Modi during the summit. We had asked that 3 or 4 participants from civil society would be included, but in the end, only 1 person from the north and 1 from the south were included. So this is how an ad hoc group of people from French NGOs was created to coordinate the civil society involved in the working groups, sharing information, making comments on the documents. Gaia is here, for example. Thank you, Gaia, for your coordination work, for your #1 working group. And we quickly realized that concerning the preparation of the summit and its legitimacy, as we had already said, the states represented in the working groups were basically countries from G20 with 1 or 2 countries from the south, and then representatives from the institutions. There were not many representatives from civil society, maybe because they were not given much time to speak, or their points were not included in the agendas. And this is something we realized. We took notice of quite quickly concerning the French civil society. We tried to include the perspective of the South, which was difficult because we were being asked to react 48 hours, and then we are not listened to. We were not taken into account. After the summit, we found out that the countries from the South were frustrated because they were only asked about their opinions 15 days earlier to accept an already written document. And this was planned by the Paris Forum and the Paris Club. So they had the feeling that this had been written by the countries in the north, especially France. This is something that we saw during the summit. This is something that we had to deal with. Emmanuel Macron, who was delivering this, said they were trying their best, but the countries in the south are asking for an urgent reform with interventions on Kenya or Chad. And personally, despite the fact that we had asked since the month of December, we had warned about the danger of another pro-Macron summit with very few inclusive issues, so like it was the case during his presidency. In fact, his lack of political implication was totally confirmed, as the other speakers have already said. And was a non-question. If we ask for a representativity and legitimacy, this has to be tackled, including all these issues. The fact of reestablishing North-South trust is a total failure. We need to capitalize this in order to bear in mind the voice of the people in the countries from the South for a real transformation of the international financial architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. And I'm just going to say a few things from the perspective of Center for Economic Social Rights, which works on, we're coming at this issue from the approach more of international human rights law and what's required in terms of climate justice. I mean, I think all these speakers have brought out very powerfully that what we've seen is a lot of sound and fury, which is ultimately not signifying anything in this context. But I think that there are dangers of this which go beyond the fact that there was a pageantry and there was a lot of things that came out. There were a lot of failed promises. And I think the danger here is the approach that we are seeing, which I think a number of the speakers have spoken about, but Mariana and Carola talked about in particular. I mean, this is an area, states are approaching the whole area of resourcing for what we call resourcing for climate justice, or what states prefer to talk about more narrowly as climate finance, as an area which is entirely one of charity or one where they can have voluntary approaches. And this is completely inconsistent with the reality, which is this is an area where they have a range of international obligations under a whole range of treaties, and in fact, going to the very much to the core even of what the UN Charter was set up to address, which is international cooperation and assistance to deal with global issues, particularly ones that affect human rights and nature. And so what we're seeing is this voluntary approach. And I think that is what the summit does very well. It pushes the advantage of a voluntary approach. It makes it look like it's something good. And more dangerously, it also pushes the idea of a scarcity narrative, I think, which Mariana and a couple of other speakers have referred to. This myth that the money does not exist. I think Jayati's talked about the fact the money can be made available. It's there, but we see a very strong myth that is getting more and more entrenched. And I'm sorry to say, it's not just happening in the Paris Summit. It's something we are also seeing in the UN spaces. It's coming out even in the reform of our common agenda from the Secretary General. There is a myth that the resources don't exist from states, and the only way that those resources can be realized is by using public finance or development aid to de-risk private investment. And this is extremely dangerous in terms of what's being put on the table, but it is also completely inconsistent with what is required under international law. What we're dealing with here is an issue that we have to talk about, is an issue of responsibility, and there is the responsibility of the states who have contributed to the problem, who have helped hold back information about the scale of the problem and its effect, as well as the companies who have been closely involved in doing so. And for many years, human rights lawyers were concerned because of the issues of causality, because of the difficulties of dividing up, who was responsible for what. But we now have a lot of evidence about exactly the scale of contribution and the breakup of that contribution across different actors, from databases such as the carbon majors databases to more recent efforts to actually even try and quantify what is required in terms of reparations. The missing word that we see in all of these discussions at the international level is reparations. There is no acknowledgement that there is a need for a reparations-based framework. And we would only have to reverse the reality. If we talked about the effects of take any other imaginary crisis, where the cause of the crisis was the behavior of global South countries, and the manifestation of that crisis was happening right now in global North countries, there would be a completely different discussion that would be happening at the moment about responsibility, about compensation, about corrective measures, about steps that have to be taken to ensure that these things don't happen again. And I think these are some of the things to talk about. But since probably international law is the least interesting aspect of this discussion, I'm going to go back to our other speakers with some follow-up questions. I'll go perhaps in reverse order this time, starting with Matthew. And for all the speakers, I mean, we have obviously already a quick reflection in this group of where we are right now. And a number of challenges have been identified by all the speakers, not just in terms of the failed promises, but also of the approaches that are being pushed. And I think, as I mentioned, a question on people's mind is, what does this mean? There was all of this discussion that's happened in Paris. There's a roadmap that was set out. There is a sort of summary of where these things are going to come from. To give one example, France and the UK have announced that they will be doing a roadmap for a market on biocredits. So there are some practical things coming out of this at the bilateral and at the multilateral level. So it'll be great to hear from all of you, if you could identify one or two proposals for reform that you think would be useful for civil society groups and governments to prioritize. And that could be prioritized, we would hope, in the sense of something good that was suggested that could be taken forward. It could have been by a government or by a civil society actor, or something that's coming up that needs to be countered. So I'll start with Matthew again. Start Matthew this time.
Thank you,
Matthew.
Thank you. Oui, en effet, si on peut-être revenir sur quelques mesures, à mon avis, au côté.
Yes, in fact, we can focus on certain things that have been done. So first of all, we need to take into account what's happened. And I think that their priority is, on the one hand, asking for the cancellation of the debt. They might be whether bilateral or private. because both at the government level as well as in other areas, we need to ask for this cancellation of the debt, because that way they will be able to cover the essential needs of the countries asking for this, as well as those countries that have medium income. And now, taking into account Zambia's example, we need to see how the private sector can take part in the area. We need to clearly say that the private sector has to respect the debt agreements implemented internationally and taking into account what we have seen and checking the injustice of the international architecture, as we have seen with Brazil, Kenya, Tunisia, etc. We need to use these declarations to try to create a new conference for debt in 2025, because that way we will be able to create an independent tool which is going to be based on the ideas of the United Nations. And it has to be done outside these summits because there is an institution to talk about it, and it's the United Nations.
Thank you. Thanks very much with you. And I'm going to then look to Carola to answer the same question.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with Matthew. I think economic justice movements have been working for many years in a lot of proposals. One very important is to create this multilateral body for debt resolution under the UN, to create a fair space for creditors and debtors to negotiate. Right now, it's not happening. It's totally unfair, and we are depending on the political will of small wealthy groups of countries, and yeah, that's not going to solve anything. And these countries are recommending to rely on more debt to resolve our problems, so that's not going to solve the problem, of course. And the second proposal is, of course, to reform the global economic governance. For example, in the Bretton Woods institutions, now we have been talking a lot about the reform in the World Bank and the IMF. I think a very important reform would be to give more representation and participation for poor and vulnerable countries in the decision-making process. Right now, the board of these institutions is made of especially guided by the power of wealthy countries, and they receive even the benefits. For example, when there was the allocation of special drawing rights, they were distributed very unfairly according to the quota criteria. So wealthy countries received a lot, and poor and low and middle income countries receive very few. But these resources were very useful, and Latinidad has been promoting this as a solution, and we are asking and requesting a new issuance of SDRs for the climate agenda, for the 2030 agenda, because we have published recently a report showing that these resources were very important for our countries without creating debt and without leading to conditionalities. And right now, the rechanneling of SDRs that the Paris Summit and the Bridgetown Initiative are promoting are nothing else than more loans and conditionalities for our country. So that's not fair. And that's something that we're criticizing. And I will share a link to our critical statement with another proposals and critics that I would like to share also with all the audience.
Thanks very much, Carola. And just a reminder to everyone in the audience that you can please also start typing your questions. We've seen a few come in to the questions, but please do type your questions so we can try and collate those and also present them to everyone in the panel to respond to. Okay, and then I will look at Mariana.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually add on into something that Carola just mentioned. Right now, I think we have a really great opportunity to move the agenda forward when it comes to global economic governance in IFIs, as the IMF is doing its review of its quota. In the next 2-3 months, it could be really a good opportunity to put some pressure to have some form of increased participation of Global South in economic decision making, and it's a good window for us to work together on that. I also think the moving forward, the negotiations on loss and damage, as the transition committee is meeting now in August, for example, really important from the Pact Summit is really where how climate finance will be channeled. So ensuring the loss and damage fund created in COP27 is filled. And it is, again, pushing for that public additional grants-based finance that we need. And the third thing is we have in October the timing for the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, and even though it might not be a perfect instrument, it is an instrument where developing countries have equal participation. So channeling climate finance through GCF is really important, and the timing in October is something good to act. So I'm just to leave this proposition for these 3 initiatives.
Thanks very much, Mariana. And over to Jyoti.
Yeah, thank you very much. So 2 things. One, in terms of, the things that are available to do. Of course, there are so many things available, but one of them is so evidently the possibilities of raising your own resources through taxation. We have the most unequal world economy we have ever seen. Our own economies are more unequal than ever in terms of both wealth and income. And yet we are not taxing the very rich or large corporations. Those things are available. We know what needs to be done. We know that there are ways of making sure that multinational corporations pay the same tax rates as local corporations. That's not asking too much, right? Just the same rate as domestic corporations. You treat them as one corporation globally, you take your share of the global profits and tax that according to some formula. It should be easily available. The current global architecture doesn't allow it. Similarly, wealth taxation. We don't actually know who's holding wealth because we don't collect information on wealth holding. And everyone tells you, oh, it's impossible, it's too difficult. It's not. Now we have mostly a lot of wealth held in financial assets and real estate. The real estate is already known. We can actually figure out the financial assets. We can compile asset registers, insist on beneficial owners. That is not just opaque trusts that you don't know who actually benefits from, but insist that every trust has to reveal its beneficial owners and then tax the wealth. Even a very, very small tax on extreme wealth, on maybe 0.1% of the population, will generate huge revenues, including in developing countries. And of course, that means also tackling illicit financial flows, which are enabled by all these tax havens, not just in all these famous islands. The biggest tax havens are in the US, in the UK, in Europe. Let's be quite clear about that. The islands of Jersey and Guernsey, certain states of the US like Delaware and so on, and certain countries in Europe like Ireland and the Netherlands. So we really need to address the issues of tax avoidance, not just evasion, but avoidance, and it can be done. Now, it's all fine to say that we can hope for a multilateral deal. And of course, I still hope for a multilateral deal and for international negotiations. But in the meantime, what do we do? And what do countries who keep hoping and who keep attending these meetings and rush from one meeting to the next and sit there and hope that it will finally get taken? What do we do? I think we have to recognize the subtext of all of this, which is the unequal power balances. And the reason why developing countries, lower income countries, lack power is also because they are not working at this together. They have to get united. If debtors get together and present a common front, it's a very different deal from then Zambia going alone to face all of its creditors or Sri Lanka going alone. If all lower income countries facing major climate loss and damage issues get together and say, well, we're not going to pay the following things, or we're going to impose all kinds of other taxes and restrictions on the tourists who come from your countries to benefit from our resources and so on, it will change the game. So in the absence of anything else shaking up the global establishment, I think it's really time for countries that are deeply and terribly affected to get together and act together.
Thanks very much, Jyoti. And because some of the questions are already asking for what's coming up in the next 12 months, that is a strategic opportunity in that regard, since I think many of our organizations are pushing for this. It's very important to highlight the negotiations around a potential UN tax convention following on from Jayati's very important remarks. Jayati, do you want to comment on that?
I just want to make one, in fact, precisely on this point. Right now in Latin America, in July, there is going to be a big regional tax conference hosted by Chile and Colombia, with Brazil and many other countries participating. I think that's a sign of the way to go.
Thanks very much, Jayati. And I will pass back to Yolanda. Yolanda.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with with all the previous speakers and colleagues. I'm going to go back to something that Meghna, you said, which is the call for reparations. I think we need to stress that call higher and louder when we do our campaignings, because it's not just about reparations. As Matthew said, I was part of the discussions in Working Group 1 of this summit thing, and there was this negotiation around this MDB vision statement. And one of the things that countries like Brazil, but also China, was trying to include there is something as revolutionary as CBDR, so common but differentiated responsibilities. And Japan and the US and Europe pushed back on this. So, I mean, something that is an international agreement in the Paris Agreement, they were pushing back on this. So we really need to stress the need for the global North to take on their responsibilities with climate change. And I think the call for reparations is a strong message there. Obviously, that cancellation, I'm going to share, we're trying to build up momentum on this, and we launched a statement the day of the summit was starting, marking the 160 days before the COP. And what we're saying is, before the COP, we need debt cancellation. We need an agreement on debt cancellation, because this is urgent for countries facing climate, but also facing the development crisis that they are facing. The role of the private sector. I mean, the push for market-based solutions is huge, and we need to push back. And we need to push back on the way Jayati was just saying. They have obligations, tax obligations, obligation towards climate, obligations towards human rights. Matthew and I were in a meeting the day before the summit on debt, and we're discussing this debt transparency thing. And one of the speakers said, well, just make it simply. If you're not transparent on your debt is illegal and you cannot get the money back. Regulation, put proposals on the table that bring the private sector on the table, not from voluntary approaches, but from the obligation to comply with the norms, because voluntary approaches are not working. And obviously, if we give a role for the private sector on climate, they will go for the profit, not for the people's lives. I mean, we know that, everyone knows that. And finally, I think it was Mia Motley that said, what we need is transformation, not reform, profound transformation and not reform. It's a pity that the Bridgetown Initiative doesn't follow that same line. But yeah, we need transformation, and reform is not enough. And this links with the global economic governance reform. I am afraid that the pushback on the IMF quota is also important. They just want to discuss like a minor rearrangements of quota distribution, but not a profound transformation. And I think this is what we need to call for, the international financial architecture reform. And I think we have an opportunity, which is the financing for development process ahead. And I'm going to take Jayati's proposal for the global South countries to go united and apply that to us. If civil society goes united, and this, we have seen this in the past, the only way to have those gains is to go united and to be ambitious. I think, and I'm sorry about this, but one of the things that happened with this summit is that a lot of civil society were not ambitious enough. And if civil society is not ambitious, they won't deliver. So we need to be more coordinated, strategize better, and be more ambitious in our work and in our calls. Leave it there.
Thanks so much. Yolanda, there's a number of questions that have come in on debt, so I'm going to try and see if I can collate a couple for you. I think there was a question about, there's a question about from Luke, from Gibson, about what could be the could you explain in detail the consequences for countries if they simply refuse to pay debt to bilateral, multilateral, or private lenders and instead invest these funds in essential public services and climate resilience? There was also a question, I'm going to try and combine these thing, which is an anonymous question from how can we support efforts for a debtors cartel in light of the power held by credit rating agencies and possible punishments, and the need for emergency financing, which currently is hugely dependent on the Bretton Woods institutions' approval and therefore conditional to geopolitical support to G7. And Yolanda, while I'm with you, sorry, I'm giving you lots of questions together, but also a specific question from Gabriel Kohler about the CBDR, and did Germany also push back against this, because that would be against the current coalition's pledge that they're pursuing a feminist foreign policy. Okay.
Not short answers, but I'll try. On what happens, I mean, if one single country defaults and doesn't pay back, they're doomed. And we have seen this in the past with many countries. One thing is that, for instance, in the case of Zambia, the first year and a half that after they defaulted, the investment in public spending, public services, increased because they had the resources. So it works. The same happened in Argentina after the default in 2001. But the repercussions in terms of the international relations and financial support or lack of financial support are very strong. But what happens if 10 countries default? That's the question, and that's what Yayate was saying. If they go united, if they approach these negotiations united, then we're talking about a different thing. And what happens if they default and they don't negotiate with their creditors is that they don't get an IMF loan. They can maybe get resources from others, but one of the things that several crises have taught us is that if you're about to do that, you need to make sure you have energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, pharmaceutical sovereignty to be able to cover your citizens' needs. On the credit rating agencies, I mean, credit rating agencies only rate private credit financial markets debt. If you rely on financial markets debt, that's the game. You rely on credit rating agencies. What we need to put is public money on the table and other sources of financing and not financial markets. There are pushes for not only regulating credit rating agencies, but also, for instance, creating a public credit rating agency. This could be a proposal to take forward, but again, if you rely on financial markets, that's what you get. And finally, on Germany, no, Germany wasn't amongst the ones that pushed back. It was mostly Japan and the US. But we have all the documents, so we can also check if Germany pushed back on anything. I don't think they were very active in those discussions. There is a question also from Sarah Ribert on the Colombia, Kenya, France proposal on the global expert review on debt, nature, and climate. We don't know much about that. It's just the headline that we know. But I think we need to be aware that, because this has to do with debt swaps, with this new kind of debt swaps that the financial markets are putting on the table. If correctly done, this can be maybe helpful for some countries, but this won't solve the debt crisis. If your country is in a debt crisis with unsustainable debt levels, a debt swap won't be a solution. And I think one problem is to have this as a smoke screen to what we need, which is debt cancellation for the countries that need debt cancellation from all creditors, as Mathieu was saying.
Thanks very much, Yolanda. And I'm going to turn to Carola, actually, because there were a few questions picking up on that on the private sector. And I think specifically on, aren't we letting the private sector off the hook? How can they be held accountable for their role? And also just generally, I think some questions on how do we push back on this private financialization wave that we are seeing. Carola?
Yes, well, I think taxes is a very good instrument to make the private sector accountable, especially the big polluters. Jayati was already mentioning it. Wealth taxes, we have to acknowledge that 1% of the wealthiest groups, the elites, emits double CO2 than the 50% poorest of the population. So there's a big gap between rich and poor. And the emissions, the CO2 emissions they produce, of course. And also international taxation on fossil fuel corporations. We've heard how many millions they are doing in profits every year, how much damage they are doing to the planet, and they are not part of the UNFCCC negotiations. They are not called to do anything to stop their investments. At least they should pay, and that's something that Mia Motley was mentioning in some of her discourses. That we should tax them and maybe use also that money to fund, for example, the loss and damage fund or other funds, for example, the adaptation fund that works very well and gives grants to global south countries. So I think that's important. And regarding how to avoid this financialization and the big promotion of private sector as the savior, I think we have to unite it. I think, and I agree with Yolanda saying that we, civil society, have to work together. And I'm very glad this year to see climate justice movements working together with economic justice movements and starting to align the demands, understand better the topics, the relationship between the climate, and how important it is to understand the emergency and the lack of time we have to deal with this crisis, the debt crisis, the climate crisis, until before we reach this threshold of no return, this point of no return. So we really need to work together. I really believe in us and people, and not necessarily in politicians, but I really believe in the power of the people and the movements, and we have to demand it in every way, and proposing things outside the UNFCCC instruments, like the SDRs, for example, in a different distribution, using the different distribution criteria would be a very important way of solving the problem. Debt cancellation could be another very important proposition or proposal in the table. And yeah, start also analyzing the proposals, the fake solutions, the false solutions they are promoting, like carbon markets, these bio credits they are trying to put on the table, and the debt for nature swaps, the debt for climate swaps, that we have proven that they have a very small potential to reduce the debt problem. And we have been analyzing the case of Ecuador, the recent case that has been solved, like the big successful case. And we have seen a lot of problems relating to transparency, integrity, and could harm sovereignty of a country if there are third parties and private sector parties like intermediaries in these operations. So we have to be very aware of that too.
Thanks very much, Carola. And Mariana, there's a few questions that I'm going to also try and group together and pass to you. One from Maria on Balsera on when we're calling for reparations together with debt cancellation. What else do we need to call for? Adequate climate resourcing, a shift to renewable energies, agroecology, and climate justice. But just if that was not big enough to answer, just a few more to make your life easy to respond to quickly. Considering one from Sandra Martinson on considering that the UN SDGs Summit will be the only global event this year, how can we leverage it to advance climate justice, debt cancellation, and broader reforms of global financial architecture? And in a similar vein, I think there was a question about the strategic priorities. What do we see as strategic priorities of the next 12 months for us in order to address these issues and to make sure that there's not yet another Paris summit, but in fact discussions are held under the UN?
Thank you. No, absolutely. Perhaps I just wanted to come back to a point we raised here, which is the issue of the common but different responsibilities and capabilities, and the fact that the breach countries, the big polluters, they have the responsibility to pay. They have to pay for their fair shares, and there are lots of different ways they can put that money on the table. So not just the debt cancellation. Fixing the global rules of taxation, or as Jyoti was mentioning, making polluters pay. Really there, and including that wealth taxation, progressive taxation, to really ensure we get that public money at scale, which is the main way to deliver the climate finance that we need to address the loss and damage, the adaptation, the just transitions. So in that vein, I agree with Carola. It's really amazing that we have climate justice, economic justice, gender justice groups working together on that agenda, on the system transformation. And we have to continue working together in a number of the upcoming moments we have, be in relation to the annuals this year in Morocco, or the it springs, etc. and internet next year. We have not just 12 months, but we have 18 months to define how climate finance after 2025 will look like under the UNFCCC, and getting that right from now is essential. For example, so I think our role as civil society is really to shape the narrative of what the state needs to deliver in terms of climate finance, calling the responsibility for rich countries to deliver that at the same time, and doing damage control and the false solutions. They won't go away that easy, and we have to keep pushing against them.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mariana. Jyoti, there was a specific question for you, again from Maria, on how could windfall taxes help climate financing in the short and medium term?
Yes, thank you. So no, absolutely. Windfall taxes can clearly play a role, but remember that most of these windfall taxes profits were made by multinational corporations. So in fact, developing countries have to be in a position to be able to tax the multinational corporations. It's going to be hard to do it in the absence of international treaty, but it is possible, as I said, if there are enough countries willing to work together and to actually do a joint strategy for taxation. So absolutely, windfall profits is one immediate, quick, easy way to go, and it should be done. Financial transactions tax is another, which is immediately available and can be done. And once again, ideally should be done internationally, but if it's not, governments can go ahead and do it on their own. I just want to add a couple of things, I saw there was a question on the accountability of the private sector. And I think that's very important. I was part of a commission board for the United Nations. I'm just going to put the reference in the chat here for looking at the global architecture in general. And we made a number of recommendations, both for planet governance and for the financial architecture. But one of the things that was very critical in that, and especially with regard to governing for the planet and nature, was the accountability of private players. It's not just enough to make states accountable or to ask states to deal with their own private players. There has to be a much more general global accountability for private players. And I think we've suggested different ways in which this can be done in that. I also want to highlight this issue about debt and climate swaps. It's absolutely right. I think Mariana mentioned it, or Carola, that these have not worked as they've intended. But what's also bad is that even in the so-called success stories like Belize, they spent a huge amount for the technical process on these consultancies. So Credit Suisse actually took half of the money that should have gone to Belize in terms of that reduction of debt through its fees for managing the process. At least those should be handled by multilateral development banks or other institutions. There's no reason why a country should be forced to pay enormous technical fees for getting a debt for climate swap. That's ridiculous. A final point I just want to make, the governments act very rapidly when they think that there is a systemic danger. So we saw in the month of March, right? Within a week, Silicon Valley Bank is managed. Over a weekend, Credit Suisse is managed. All the rules are broken. All the earlier promises and statements are denied. So, you know, developing countries face all these rules and complexities, and Ghana has to wait forever, and Chad has to wait forever, Zambia has to wait forever. Sri Lanka has to jump through hoops. Pakistan is still jumping through hoops. But when it comes to a potentially systemic problem, bam, it's done, right? No matter how bad they have been, no matter you know what problems are involved, no matter how much money is involved. We have to get that sense of urgency. And you cannot get that sense of urgency if you're just one small island developing country, or if you're a little African country. It will not happen. So you have to actually work together to actually make that seem like a systemic problem. That's the only way in which you will get change. Final point in terms of, you know, NGOs, and I think there are many of my friends in different NGOs here. You know, the summits and these events are the culmination of a process. But we now have a zillion summits. We have them all the time. There's G7, there's G20, there's COP, there's, you know, non-formal things like the France summit. They go on. There is the UN, other meetings, there's the General Assembly, there's the Social Summit, there's the Summit for the Future. It can go on, SDG Summit, it can go on and on and on. And I'm not sure whether the energy we're expending in rushing to all of these summits to make our voice heard at the summit matters. By the time the summit happens, all the damage is done. It's all decided before the summit happens. I think we have to be more strategic in terms of where we spend our energy and resources and how we intervene, whether we're working with governments who can then argue the case in particular arena, or we're working in other ways for civil society. But I don't know whether this rushing from event to event globally and being distracted by these is the best way to go.
Thanks very much, Jayati. Matthew, I was going to also pass you. There was a specific question also, again, similar to what's been coming up on from Federico, on should we as civil society push for a specific debt cancellation mechanism, given the failure of the basically heavily indebted poor countries initiative to prevent a new debt crisis. There's also a question that could be interesting for you to answer, I think from Emma, on, you know, basically she on the response of the global financial media to the summit. She said that she thought they'd just be repeating Macron's summit statements, but actually she found a few pieces of reporting that placed the emphasis on the divergences between the global North and South interests in these discussions. Could the summit perhaps have been helpful in helping us all see things more clearly and be more ambitious, as Yolanda put it?
Thank you, Meghna. Pour revenir sur la première question, justement sur un peu le quid des annulations post-IPPTE, donc IPIC en anglais.
In reference to debt cancellation,
continuera en fait à dire toutes ces discussions-là doivent avoir lieu dans un cadre
all these issues needs to take place at the UN level. There cannot be just rich countries deciding what they are going to be doing. No, this is the importance of coming back to UN level debates. Concerning French media, we have seen some articles about it, but there is an interesting point. At the French level, at least before the meeting, the French media had taken the press report word by word. It was a big event informing about how the world will be changed. This is ABC, what the agenda is going to be covering. And the contacts I had with the journalists later, after the event, even after the event, were, what was that for? All this noise for nothing, all much ado for nothing. It had to be about the transformation of international finance architecture, but we see that civil society is disappointed because measures are very weak. But this is bringing the issue back on the table. if there is one positive point, it's that at least in terms of financing and development, the French example was not in the media. For years, it hadn't been in the media. For example, when a country will not pay for the rest, there is no debate about international debt. So I think that media coverage has had a critical outlook now, not before the event. There was no criticism, but at least at the French level, there was criticism after the summit, which allowed to bring this issue back on the agenda, back in the agenda for the public opinion to be able to discuss this.
Thanks very much, Matthew. I'm going to take the one on, there was a question about collectively, how can we move collectively and more comprehensively towards demanding state public finance for developing countries as an obligation under international law, starting with submissions to the current ICJ advisory opinion proceedings. Legal financial obligations and consequences didn't feature on the Paris summit agenda at all. So yes, I mean, I think just very quickly, and other speakers should add as well, from my perspective, there's been a real sea change in terms of what we're seeing in terms of legal efforts, and ones I will confess that maybe 10, 15 years ago, we thought were not at all feasible, but they are making tremendous breakthrough at various both regional and international courts and sort of treaty bodies, monitoring mechanisms, and I think they're really important. Someone who's following the ICJ proceeding should come in further, but obviously the ICJ is more restrictive in who it takes on in terms of submission, so that is important, but there is space there to be looking at nation. There's also right now the current opportunity American Court on Human Rights, and they're looking at in that regard. I think it's the court, not the commission. I could be wrong there. But I think importantly for me, I think question of framing. So outs are going to take time. The framing, which I think some of the speakers have already been referring to. And I think there it's also not just what civil society, how do we frame the demands of what we're asking? And how far do we fall into this kind of narrow thematic sort of sectoral framing that states and the UN likes to give us? Or how much do we frame this as the broader call for what's actually requiring to state obligations, whether in international human rights law or in international environmental law or other frameworks that we should be looking at? And I think they're a very important question on the table that we saw very vividly illustrated during the pandemic and even the negotiations around the TRIPS waiver, is how much developing country governments are also framing their demands in terms of these obligations, because that is an area that is actually quite far behind on many of these questions. And there I was also going to come in, thanks Gabrielle, on that as well. I mean, linking to the private sector, I mean, there is a lot happening at the moment. There's obviously the Treaty on Business and Human Rights, but there's many initiatives to be targeting and making the private sector accountable for its responsibility. But again, they happen outside the kind of conventional fora. They may not be happening in the development spaces, they're happening in the business and human rights frameworks. And I think making those linkages is really important, because just to put an issue, we have seen very, very few cases, for example, really challenging the responsibility. And we have great evidence that biodiversity loss is linked very closely to the activities of a group of companies. There is actually excellent data showing the scale of biodiversity loss is linked to the actions, particularly of extractive and, for example, agribusinesses. You can trace it, but there have been very, very few initiatives actually challenging and holding liability for those. Rather, again, the attempt, particularly in the biodiversity space, which is very disturbing, is to be talking about having conservation-based approaches, biodiversity markets, and land being set aside for offsetting type projects, again, with all of the ramifications that does have for indigenous and other communities. So I think linking these issues, I think, is a key aspect of if we want to make the obligations arguments, and most importantly, reparations, but also international cooperation and assistance, which is the broad framing. That is what states are required to do. It's an obligation. It requires concrete action to be responding to these kinds of global issues. But that framework is very, very underutilized. But just moving, we had a couple of questions I'm just going to throw open to everyone on the panel. Specifically, there were two questions on Africa. So one of the questions was, we are perfectly aware in Africa and specifically in Mali that there is currently no longer clear content of the term climate justice. Apologies, because we're translating from French, so we might be losing some of the nuance there, especially me. But the question is, we would ask that the biggest polluters may set up a fund for people to be able to have more resilience. But in your opinion, generally speaking, what can be done to advance, I think, the concept of climate justice? And then the second question, what do you think of the interventions by African leaders from Chad, Kenya, South Africa, etc.? What more do African countries need to do in a year when the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF will be held in Africa, in Morocco? Would anyone on the panel like to come in on those? And then there are a couple of specific questions as well.
I could come in on the last one.
Please.
Because I think that was very revealing. And it was not just in the last session, but in different sessions, you could see positions from different leaders from the global south that were kind of challenging the global north, the IFIs, even we had this dead panel where the Tunisian president was very loud and challenging Kristalina, who was on the room. So I think one of the things is disseminating those voices. I mean, we have the videos, we have those calls, and I think we should we should actively put that out there and push for more calls in that direction.
Thanks very much. And Jayati has to leave early. So Jayati, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for all your fantastic remarks and interventions. Thank you. And Mariana, I'm going to pass over to you to come in on the first part of the question.
Yeah, just on the first part of the question, in terms of the big polluters setting up a fund, actually it's the responsibility of the states to do that. Nothing is stopping rich countries at the moment to start doing taxation of the major polluters, and that's really linked with ways we understand the climate finance, so they can really pay their fair share. It's about the reparations they owe to the global south in terms of their development, in terms of them making a transition to a clean future, to address loss and damage and deal with adaptation. So I think that's probably like one of the main things to address that point. Just to complement one of the things which for me I'm happily picked that a bit, but how the southern countries in the pact of the speeches were really clear, not agreeing with that agenda. I think it was the South African leader was saying we're not but beggars, and so challenging the whole narrative in terms of this is not charity, this is a right, and we have to sit on the table as equals. For me is quite critical, and I would hope that moving forward to Morocco, COP, etc. This is the bit that we have to be supporting and pushing forward.
Thanks very much, Carola. Just turning to you if you want to add to that. And also there was actually one specific question that was sent for you, which is how do we address the existing national and local state capability challenges to implement climate solutions? Quite a big question again for in a couple of minutes.
Okay, I wanted to build on what Yolanda was mentioning about the African leaders first, please. I think we also need to learn from them. Other regions like Latin America and the Caribbean need to work together. I think the African group is a very strong bloc in the negotiations under the UN. We can see that in the UNFCCC process. In the ECOSOC, FFD process as well, they have achieved good results in terms of the proposal of the tax convention under the UN, for example. And I think the union makes union is the option, the key to achieve all that we want. And I think other regions like mine need to start working together. And we have a lot of expectations with these new governments, Lula, Petro could be good leaders to guide into that direction.
Thanks very much, Carola. Matthew, did you want to come in with anything? Do you want to respond to any of the points?
Oui, merci. Oui, en effet, juste pour rebondir, voilà, pareil sur ce que disaient Yolanda et Carola, en effet, je pense que c'est vraiment, enfin, comme je disais aussi tout à l'heure, mais de surfer aussi sur cette vague
As I was saying before, we need to surf this wave of leaders. Some leaders have actually gone there to say that they didn't agree with what was actually happening. So it's obvious that we need to push forward so we can actually listen to their voices, to show that the voices of the countries of the North shouldn't always be heard, that their agenda is not the agenda of the whole world, and that we have alternative solutions to what the countries in the North are proposing, what they call revolutionary measures. At the same time, we have to clearly show what are the alternatives, and as we said before, we as members of the civil society need to get together. We have been strong, but we need to be way more ambitious in regards to what we want to have, and taking into account the emergency of the situation. That's what we need to do.
Thanks very much, Matthew. And we have a question from Teresa Anderson, which is about she's noted a couple of worrying patterns across the broader climate finance sphere. First is a deliberate confusion by rich countries between real money, grants, public finance, and loan, and when these are entirely different kinds of money that play out differently, and multilateral development banks and the World Bank positioning themselves to distribute and control climate increasing amounts of finance, including through various initiatives. And would anyone like to comment on these patterns, how they connect and may play out? Just a very quick response from me, given the time, and then I'll see if anyone else on the panel wants to add. I think that's absolutely right. And perhaps that goes to the very centrality of what we're trying to discuss here. I've got a reminder to speak softly, sorry. The centrality of what we are discussing here, which is I think that there is a positioning here. The positioning is all about existing actors, despite their problems. We know that the World Bank Group is extremely problematic in how it has approached issues of climate financing, how its role in debt, in austerity, but it is positioning itself through its roadmap as the savior and suggesting that it be given more money. And we're seeing this across different things. I think that's absolutely vital. I think Jayati talked about that earlier. Mariana talked about that confusion of what is climate finance. And I would just say from my perspective, also someone who came to this debate from a different angle, I think the complexity of these issues is just a sort of artificial barrier to the greater participation of more civil society groups. It becomes more and more technical, it makes it more and more hard. And I think we need to deconstruct what's actually happening in these spheres and show what's actually happening, the reality of the 100 billion goal. First of all, that was completely arbitrary, but how is it being reached? The types of financing we're talking about and the role of multiple actors. But I'm going to stop there and thank all the panelists. So thank you so much, all of you, for agreeing to speak at this event. It was really wonderful. It came together very last minute with lots going on. So thank you so much to all the speakers, and thank you to all the organizations. As I mentioned at the beginning, this event was co-organized by Eurodad, obviously, and a big thanks to Eurodad, to colleagues there, Yolanda, Paulina, and others who really helped with all the technicalities, the distribution, getting this set up, which was not easy, but also others, CAN International, CAN France, Budget Advocacy Network, and of course, the Center for Economic and Social Rights. A big thank you to all the interpreters, because this was not easy, given the reality of pulling this together so last minute and commenting on outcomes that only came out last week. We didn't send them much in advance. So Jose, Kathy, Leah, Mariam, thank you so much for doing an amazing job. And lastly, I'd also just want to thank my colleague Alina, who's played a vital role in behind the scenes coordinating and making this happen. And also Rafael, who's been helping us coordinate the events, etc. So thank you all, and thank you everyone who participated and listened. Unfortunately, we can't see you with the way these things are set up, but we hope you found it interesting and useful. So thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.